So welcome all of you. Thank you so much for being here to support Marissa. The way that this is, I'm Dr. Lowe, I'm her co-chair with Dr. Corkill, and she's going to say that here in a minute. But the way I wanted to give you all a little instruction in case this is your first. The way that this will go is Marissa's going to present for about 35 minutes or so, her study, kind of bring you all up to speed on what she did and what her outcomes were. And after that, we'll open it up to questions from all of you. After a certain amount of time that we've had questions from you all, we will ask you to leave, and then the committee will have our meeting with Marissa, okay? All right, so Marissa, take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Lowe. Welcome to the Graduate Commons, my second home. I want to first extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone that came to support today. I wish I could thank you all individually, but when I look at you, I can think about an interaction that we've shared or an opportunity that you've given me or support that you provided and how much it's touched my journey and been a big part of helping me to get where I am today. So I really appreciate that. This journey actually began 6 years ago when Dr. Lowe and I had a conversation about joining the PhD program and the opportunities of understanding student-athlete performance and development. And she's really the catalyst as to how I move from student-athlete lens to scholar in this area and understanding performance from an academic side. And so that wonderful opportunity paired with a tremendous graduate assistantship in student-athlete academic services with SAS really fueled my passion as a practitioner. And I got to learn from some of the best in the field. They're here today, who helped me develop as a life skills coordinator, an academic advisor. But really this experience is what fueled my passion to help students develop not only on the field and in the classroom, but also as a person. And I'll forever be grateful for that. And then this last year I had a great opportunity to be a teaching assistant in our department. And one of those experiences was assisting Dr. Lowe with her Intercollegiate Athletic Administration course and teaching future higher education leaders who are aspiring to be intercollegiate athletic administrators potentially. So it was a synergy of these experiences that really led to how I arrived here today and how this project came to fruition. And it absolutely would not have come to fruition if not for my committee, and especially my co-chairs, Dr. Lowe and Dr. Corkill, who have been absolutely tremendous for me, who are experts in what they do and have guided this entire process. And I have a lot of thank yous that I'll get to say to them after. I have a limited amount of time, so I also want to thank Dr. Rosser for her student support and always being an advocate of my success, and then Dr. Farr as well for our interactions and for being willing to step in. For Dr. Guadagnoli and Dr. Martinez, who I'd also like to acknowledge as committee members that helped this project come to fruition as well. This is an overview of where we're headed today. I'll give you a little background. My committee is really familiar with the study, so we'll spend most of the time on the results and the discussion. The student-athlete success literature is rich, and I'll try to condense it in that academic performance is typically measured by graduation rates and GPA. Athletic performance, on the other hand, is not as well defined. We use athletic traits such as identity or motivation to understand athletic performance, but it's still an area that needs further development. The factors that contribute to or influence student-athlete performance can be organized under these lenses. And so pre-college factors such as GPA or standardized test scores, external factors that inhibit or contribute to performance like scholarship or policy implications, and then internal factors such as psychological traits or personality traits among student-athletes and examining performance. However, this is an area that needs further work because this is the area that we can actually affect as practitioners and as faculty in helping develop the student throughout their higher education experience. So this is how the frameworks came to fruition. Mindset is psychologically based by Carol Dweck, where we can have a growth mindset or a fixed mindset about our abilities, essentially how we see ourselves through that lens. Personal growth initiative is our active engagement and seeking out behaviors that are going to help us grow as individuals. And then student-athlete experiences, and that helps quantify the academic, social, and everyday experiences of student-athletes on campus. I won't go through this matrix, but you can see that there's a lot of positive qualities that have been developed and understood because of these frameworks in these specific populations. However, mindset and personal growth initiative has not been studied previously with the student-athlete population, and experiences has only been looked at to examine practical gains and liberal arts gains. And so this is the first time we'll be using it for performance as well. The significance of this study can be defined by academic and athletic performance first being studied together. The literature tends to examine these entities independent of one another. That's problematic because we expect the student athlete to excel not only in the classroom but on the playing field as well. We'll also distinguish between levels of performance. In this study, we'll call them high and low, and that is a contribution as well, and that a lot of literature looks at performance as a general item. The focus on internal factors and these frameworks within this population is another significant of this study, and then we'll also be looking at the athletic performance metric that was piloted for use in this study. The research question: how do academic and athletic performers of various ability levels differ on academic and athletic mindset, personal growth initiative, and academic, social, and everyday experiences? So I want to talk a little bit about the process. The data collection took place over 13 long weeks. It was more challenging than I expected it to be, and I want to acknowledge the practitioners and administrators in this room who contributed to that process and really helped make this possible for me. I'm very, very appreciative. We worked with 6 institutions because it was very important that we look beyond one school and try to make this study as generalizable as possible. The distribution materials were sent out electronically as well as hard copies, and that included a video of me explaining the study to try to create a personal touch, thanks to Dr. Corkill's idea. The study flyer, which I don't think got much return on investment, evidenced by all the tabs still being in place when I would walk by. And then the email to student athletes. Those materials were sent out over the course of the semester, which was a challenge for me because I had to ask for that help, and I'm so grateful for the administrators again who assisted me in this process. We went back to the drawing board because we wanted more participation, and so we went through an IRB modification and piloted new ways to reach the students, including a text message, an email straight to coaches that could be sent on, and a paper and pencil version of the survey, so it would also be accessible that way. The compensation items were sent out, including a randomized raffle that rewarded students from various institutions with an Amazon gift card for their participation, community service credit where I took the number of participants and multiplied that by the time on task and allocated an hour amount that could be used towards Mountain West and Pac-12 community service competitions. And then success tips based on the study that will go out to the students who opted in, as well as the administrators that I worked with. I worked with 4 Pac-12 institutions and 2 Mountain West Conference institutions, and if you bring your attention to the right, you can see that this equals 49.6% from the Pac-12, so about half exactly from the Pac-12, and then the other half from the Mountain West Conference. And then we had some really eager students who came across my survey link from schools in the South, and they took the survey as well, and they're denoted at the bottom. If you focus your attention on the percentages, this is the percent of students from my study in terms of sport representation, and we went ahead and compared that to the Pac-12 and Mountain West Conference representation just to again show this generalizability. And I went ahead and put check marks next to the sports where at least 60% representation was met compared to the Pac-12 and the Mountain West. The participants were of primarily junior and senior standing, with some postgraduate presence as well. And that was because we wanted students with the greatest credentials academically and athletically who were well into their career. We ended up taking the few sophomores that participated academically but not athletically because they wouldn't have had as many opportunities to earn points on the athletic performance metric. So this sample of 331 student athletes came with a wealth of majors, and I just want to point your attention to the top 5 on the right. The first most represented was business. The second was health sciences. The third was social sciences. Fourth was liberal arts, and fifth was communications. If you focus your attention on the percentages here, that's the percent of participants who identified with that description, which is language that the NCAA uses. And I went ahead and put check marks next to the ethnicities that have at least 60% representation as compared to the Pac-12 and Mountain West Conference. Getting into the statistical analysis, so academic performance was quantified by cumulative GPA. The mean GPA was 3.272 on a range from 1.97 to 4.0. We did frequency distributions and were able to determine the 33rd and 67th percentiles and where the GPAs fell. And so the lower third went from a 0 to a 3.1 GPA, upper third 3.521 to 4.0, and then we didn't use the middle third so that we could really differentiate between high and low levels of performance. The process of creating the athletic performance metric, I went ahead and pulled the items from the literature that are used most commonly to assess or look at athletic performance. And then we went with an expert panel nationally and asked experts in this field, intercollegiate athletics, higher education, to please rate the item in terms of what is most important to quantify athletic performance, and also to provide item feedback on the different responses. From there, I employed 2 different scoring methods a total of 4 times to determine the item ranking. And the great thing about using multiple methods was that it provided continuity and it was consistent across the board as to what items rose to the top for quantifying athletic performance. And that was athletic awards like All-American, All-Conference, second, roster status, first or second team. Third was how they rated themselves in terms of reaching their potential on a scale of 1 to 100. Fourth was postseason, and fifth was scholarship. From there, point values were assigned on a scale from 0 to 10 for each of the item responses in order to create an equidistant measure, and then from there, emphasis points were also assigned to ensure that athletic awards was receiving the greatest emphasis for points all the way down to scholarship. Similar to the academic performance method, we have a mean GPA of 133.45 on a scale from 0 to 260. Now it's important to note that this is actually a modified scale. We were finding that the postseason item was really problematic in that we had sophomores athletically saying they had been to postseason 4 or 5 times. However, you can only go to postseason 1 time per year. So we went ahead and removed this item from the analysis to ensure that the metric was as accurate as possible.
Very good.
Our lower third scores up to 115 and the upper third 155 to 260, and then similar to academic performance, we removed the middle third to differentiate between these 2 groups. We ran an independent samples t-test to make sure that these low and high performing groups were statistically different from one another, and they were with the p-value of 0.00 with anything under 0.05 demonstrating significance. Looking at the correlation matrix, the strongest correlations occurred between the actual mindset subscales and then PGI subscales with themselves, and then student athlete experience subscales. And then everything else that's not in bold determines or demonstrates that it's a lower correlation. And this allowed us to run the mindset, PGI, and student-athlete experiences inventories or dependent variables independently in the multivariate analysis of variance. So what did we find? How do academic and athletic performers differ on mindset, academic mindset? This quadrant will show in the next few slides where academic performance is across the top with athletic on the side, and then we have the means for low and high performers for academics and athletics. This was on a scale from 1 to 7, 7 meaning a growth mindset, 1 being a fixed mindset. So you can see these scores are towards the higher end, and they're not much different from one another. Before I get into that, the test of homogeneity of variances was violated, and so we had to run these univariately for mindset only. There was a non-significant interaction for academic and athletic performers on mindset, so no combination of low-low, low-high, high-low, or high-high resulted in a significant difference on academic mindset. When we just looked at academic scores only, there was no significant difference there. And then when we looked at athletic scores only, there was no statistically significant difference there. Athletic mindset. There was a non-significant interaction for academic and athletic performers on athletic mindset. Looking at academic performance only, now this actually is not statistically significant, however it comes very close, 0.07 away. So we're not going to talk about this from a statistically significant standpoint, but maybe what it could mean from a practical standpoint. And this was differences for academic performers on athletic mindset. And then there was no statistically significant difference for athletic performers only on athletic mindset. Moving right along to personal growth initiative, the homogeneity of variances test was upheld, so we did run these through the MANOVA. And there was a non-significant interaction for academic and athletic performers on personal growth initiative. These scores are also on a scale from 1 to 7, with 7 being higher levels of personal growth. And you can see these scores are up on the upper end and also very close together in terms of their mean average. Looking at academic performers only, there was no statistically significant difference for academic performers on personal growth initiative, and then the same is true for athletic performers on personal growth initiative. And the experiences inventory. The test of homogeneity of variances was upheld. There was a non-significant interaction for academic and athletic performers on experiences. This is on a scale from 1 to 4, with 4 meaning that you engage in the activity very often, 1 meaning never. However, there was a statistically significant difference for academic performers only. So when we went to investigate where that was, we looked at the univariate follow-up test, and we saw that that significance was for academic performers on academic experiences. You can see the difference in the means here that were statistically significant. And there was no difference for athletic performers on the experiences inventory. So what does this mean? I want to make the case that we first investigated further internal factors among different levels of performers, and I would say that this was actually a high-performing audience, based on the idea that over 80% had a 3.0 GPA and above. 40% of that actually had a 3.5 GPA and above, which is earning you Dean's List honors, and as well as all conference honors as well. And then less than 20% of the population had under a 3.0 GPA, and less than 8% had what we would deem at the at-risk level in the field at a 2.5 GPA. So this is a very high-performing group. I'm sure there were some advisors who would love to have one of these teams on their roster. And we can see that the high-performing group mean average was 3.5, and the low-performing group didn't even get to that at-risk level at a 2.75. So what this tells us is that this was a high-performing group, and perhaps that's why we didn't see some of the differences that we were thinking we would see in terms of mindset. 80% of this group holds a growth mindset towards their abilities, academic abilities. And this was an unexpected result. And it was unexpected because we did a pilot study with 100 student athletes, although it was just at one school, and we saw a nice distribution of fixed and growth mindset individuals. However, in this study, that wasn't the case. And Dweck even states that in any classroom that you visit, you'll have a group of 40% on the growth side, 40% on the fixed side, and 20% in the middle, the ambiguous beliefs, where they're not sure where they stand. We did some supplemental analysis to see if it was potentially the combining of the conferences that could be influencing some of these results, and there was no difference in the mindset scores with the p-value of over 0.05. Thinking about the qualitative and quantitative differences in these two conferences, 4 of the 12 Pac-12 schools are on the 2017 U.S. News and World Report list for greatest academic institutions based on some of their matriculation rates and graduation rates. And so when we looked deeper into see if there was potentially combining the conferences was changing how we saw these GPA scores, we didn't see any difference here, with the Pac-12 having a 3.3 and the Mountain West Conference at a 3.2, and no statistically significant difference between those two. The findings from this study in that we see this growth mindset predominantly with a high achieving group of performers really supports what Dweck has seen with the K-12 levels, and that those students typically who have a growth mindset are earning better grades and doing better overall. The athletic mindset, 65.3% of these students held a growth mindset towards their athletic abilities, which again is a predominantly growth finding that we see here. However, I want to make a case that there is room to grow in that 80% of the scores on the athletic performance metric fell in the lower to middle third range. Additionally, when looking at the top 15% of performers on this metric, nearly half of them had an ambiguous or fixed mindset towards their athletic abilities. So there's still room to grow. We also remember some of those scores were in the high 4s, and that was getting towards that 4.5 ambiguous mark. So even though they fell on the growth side, there's still potential for them to grow. There tends to be this emphasis on low performers throughout the literature, and understandably so. But it's important to think about those that are sort of in the middle and on the brink of reaching that next level in their potential, and how we could potentially support them as well. Even though not always realistic, it's just something to think about with some of these findings. Dweck states that there are a lot of athletes. Think about an athlete that you might know who has all the skills. They wake up in the morning, they head to practice, and they just have it. But potentially when it comes to coachability, they're not really receptive, or they don't take feedback or criticism very well. They're more about themselves than the team. Those are fixed mindset qualities that we might be seeing among these elite performers. So it's important to continue understanding this college level and elite population, as we know that mindset has become extremely commercialized. The world champion Cubs mental skills coach says that mindset is the indoctrination into their organization. However, we don't know empirically where these elite performers stand in terms of their mindset, and so this was an attempt to dig into that a little further. And then that interesting finding that wasn't statistically significant but could have practical implication is that low academic performers were tending to gravitate towards a higher athletic mindset, growth athletic mindset. And looking back at the literature, there's a lot of work done, and we know this anecdotally, but there's also research that supports that athletics often is the priority, and that restricts the academic experience. Male student athletes, from a research standpoint, when they feel they have more to gain from performing on the athletic side, they're going to put more effort into that arena. And female student athletes have come into the higher education setting with some idealistic expectations of what to expect, and then had to transition some of those focus away to the athletic side. And a lot of this has to do with the peer group influence as well, and what the coaches and the pulse of the group values and how much they value maybe the precedence on the athletic side. Also want to point out that student athletes are required to spend hours each day performing their athletic craft with some of the best coaches in the nation, and they get to develop that craft day in and day out. However, in American higher education, we just don't have the opportunity for faculty to be able to spend those hours every single day developing that student on the academic side. So it makes sense that potentially they are seeing themselves as able to improve more on the athletic side because of that individualized coaching versus on the academic side. Personal growth initiative, there were high levels demonstrated among this audience. We can look back to chapter 2 and see that, which is a literature review, that there's a lot of work there how athletic performance does enhance some of these intangible qualities and characteristics simply by being involved. Leadership skills, short and long-term goal setting, motivation. So that can help us understand why we might have seen these higher levels and lack of differences between the high and low performers. Within the literature, there are a lot of connections made between some of the characteristics of mindset and the characteristics of personal growth initiative, with a higher correlational relationship at 0.50, with 1 being the strongest. However, in this study, mindset and PGI actually had a low correlation. And so this suggests that we could potentially look at these variables independent of one another and that they may be measuring different psychological traits.
Agree.
Using resources ranked the lowest, and this had statistical significance as well, but this is something that might not come as a surprise, knowing that student athletes have a difficult time, based on the literature, branching outside of their individual athletic realm, especially when it comes to mental health services and wellness services, and they tend to stay into that athletic setting. So interesting that the observation was this was the lowest subscale of the 4. And then looking at our final dependent variable, academic, social, and everyday experiences. This was the one significant finding that we saw statistically, in that higher academic performers tend to have a greater number of academic experiences. I want to point out, you can see the differences in the high and low performing group with that scale of 1 to 4, and 4 being very often engaging in those activities. But these activities are very individualized. They're going to the library, they're following up on a research article from class, they're doing these very self-reliant activities on their own, these high performers. And so thinking about that from a low performer standpoint, how we can continue to create environments to facilitate lower performers having more of those independent academic experiences. Faculty interaction was within that as well, which we know is a tremendous source of performance and retention rates with that student-to-faculty contact and meaningful interaction. Now, even though social interactions wasn't statistically significant, the scores and the means are pretty similar, and this was on a 40-point scale. And so you could interpret this like high academic performers are maximizing about 65% of the possible academic and social experiences based on this study. So they are working with people outside of their immediate group. The inventory kept saying with another student. Only one reference was made to somebody in the athletic realm, and so we can see from this population that this group is having those interactions with the higher education community and campus, and becoming involved with individuals outside their immediate team or support group. The NCAA is working to increase or enhance the student-athlete experience, and we know that through proposals by the Power 5 conferences that are being put forward to change the way that we count the countable hours, and therefore helping students integrate a little bit more into the higher education community and enhance the student-athlete experience is the specific terminology that is used. And then of course, student-athlete development programs, my favorite, are working to increase this as well by integrating those activities into their course content or into their programming. And specifically, when you have a course that meets regularly, you can embed some of those activities and experiences into the syllabus to help increase those experiences. And then that interesting finding that high athletic performers didn't have different types of experiences compared to low athletic performers, which is contrary to what we see in the literature, that high commitment athletes have less experiences, they're not as involved. However, although it wasn't statistically significant, athletic performers actually scored higher. High athletic performers scored higher than lower athletic performers on these academic, social, and everyday experiences. So something else that we can observe from this particular study. So from a theoretical standpoint, what this means, we've examined these largely unexplored frameworks with this population and started to understand internal factors with what I would argue a high-performing group of students based on some of the academic credentials that we saw. The athletic performance metric is a theoretical contribution that can be built and improved upon. And then we worked really hard to make this study on a larger scale, and so we can assume that we might see some of these findings among Division I student athletes from other institutions outside the Pacific and North regions, as well as the Rocky Mountain regions. From a practical standpoint, there's incentives that have been implemented to incentivize, for example, the academic progress rate for academic advisors. We'll see that in the coming years. And we know that regardless of what we do, performance matters. We expect students to perform both academically and athletically. Performance matters for all of us in our respective positions. And so it's important that we continue to explore these internal traits and characteristics that we can develop and facilitate in students to potentially see changes in performance. Now that we know that this population is inclined to have more of a growth mindset, that might shift the way that we work with them and potentially holding them to higher expectations or encouraging them to take that class that they might not have as much confidence in, or rewarding them for learning's sake, or acknowledging when they bounce back from adversity or setback and show that resilience. This study also supports the value of experiences and how important they are for our student athletes academically and socially especially. With any study, there's limitations. We try to have a growth mindset about that. This was a very high-performing audience. Even though we worked hard to get as many students as we could, we saw that this was a high-performing group, and so I'm not sure how much differentiation was there between the high and low-performing groups because of that high population. And from a research standpoint, the literature does support the idea that students with higher GPAs are more likely to participate in those activities. They're more likely to do that extra credit that they might not need. And we know from the literature that low performers might have a tendency to inflate their GPA. So these are things to think about and potential limitations of the study. We could consider self-reported GPA a limitation. However, I want to make the case that student athletes are fairly aware of where they stand because their continuing eligibility does require them to be performing on the academic side. So they might have a better understanding of where they stand versus their non-athletic peers. And then with any inventory that's measuring attitudes or behaviors, there's that tendency to want to appear more desirable, and the likability might increase, so that could be a limitation of this study as well. With this new metric that was piloted, we want to continue to expand and build on this, and a couple of ways we do that is fix that problematic postseason item. I want to list out the athletic awards and have them check off their what they've earned instead of I gave them a lot of liberty to fill in on the surveys what they had earned athletically. I want to remove the unsure option from scholarship award. This was language used by the NCAA that I mirrored, but it made that item a little bit harder to score as far as points. And just knowing that this is a snapshot in time of where that performer is in their career. And so it doesn't account for some of those extraneous circumstances or hardships academically or personally that can come about. And going from here, which I'm very excited about, want to build on that athletic performance metric and continue to examine how can we quantify athletic performance in higher education? How do we do that? Irrespective of sport, what is it that we can use to compare performers to one another on the athletic side? So I want to build on this metric. I also think that we can work on a more longitudinal basis. This study was very exploratory and cross-sectional in nature, and then it happened at one point in time. And so looking at these traits over time, as well as their performance credentials and any shifts, could be a future study possibility. Dweck also states that athletic mindset, as far as the interventions available, has not been conducted on the athletic side. It's been primarily on the academic side in terms of moving athletes or students from a fixed to a growth mindset. We might want to consider a metric specifically for these elite performers to measure mindset, because we've seen that this population does have a tendency to demonstrate that growth mindset, and they've gone through multiple iterations of their careers to get to this top level. So it does make sense that we're seeing more of a predominantly mindset among this group of students. And then potentially adding a coach's rating, which would triangulate and mirror more of a 360-degree evaluation. We explored that in this study. However, the IRB thought it would be problematic if for any reason those coaches' ratings of their athletes were to get out, and it could potentially implicate those that are working or striving towards playing at the next level. And then we want to find a way to incorporate those underclassmen and get them early on in their career, where their developmental stages are occurring a little bit before those upperclassmen, and potentially make differences or examine differences between sport type, gender, high profile versus low profile sports, and working towards making different comparisons in those analyses. So I'm very grateful to have spent so much time and energy on something I'm so wildly passionate about, and at this time I welcome your questions and any feedback. Dr. Keller.
I do have a question. When you selected your institutions, were they public or public-private? And then why did you choose them? And what might you find different if you mix that selection?
I tend to target those that I had a pre-existing relationship with, who I knew might be more willing to assist me in disseminating those materials. However, there were a few administrators that I hadn't met previously who were still willing to assist. So the primary target was getting some other institutions on board. I thought about the difference in public and private, but in this particular study that could be considered a limitation. Although I didn't disclose which schools they were, we didn't look at that difference or acknowledge that difference in the private versus public sector.
So were they mixed, is what you're saying?
Yeah, what's their
Were
predominant?
they public or private, or both?
They were all public.
Is there another academic measure that's popular in literature other than GPA? Maybe like credits completed, credits attempted, to get a different metric?
That it tends to be GPA and graduation rates primarily. Sometimes academic awards are asked, and we did ask that, and 65% of this group had earned academic awards. But there's a strong correlation between academic awards and GPA, so it doesn't really tell us that much different, which is why we just focused on GPA as that credential. But I understand what you're thinking in terms of other ways to examine performance levels.
Does your chapter 2 look at any of the theories of motivation for performance from the student athletes?
There's some on that, yes. I tried to pull as much as I could. I got to look at that literature for many years, which is great. And there are some studies, yes, on academic motivation. Dr. Van Reenen comes to mind as one of those scholars. But surprisingly, there aren't follow-up studies or things that we're doing to maybe use that information from more of a practical standpoint.
I was interested in the slide you had about high athletic performers and experiences. What was that again? It was
Was it that we didn't see that high athletic performers had differences in their academic experiences?
I think that might have been it. Anyway, I wonder if you get into any reasons why that might be the case, or if you.
Well, I have some speculations. I don't know if I can project those, if that's appropriate. But
Yeah, no, it's not. It's fine.
I know that it is contrary to what's typical in that we see, or it's thought of that high commitment athletes have less of that overall experience. But surprisingly, they scored higher on each of those areas compared to the low athletic performers. So perhaps like the well-rounded athlete, the complete athlete who's immersing themselves in that higher education experience and having a more fulfilled and potentially expanded experience, if you will, could potentially contribute to some of that fulfillment or positive energy or gains on the athletic side.
Marissa, just in general, I'm curious, excuse me, what was your aha moment of this whole thing? Like when you're going through all this research and you're looking at the data, and was there one specific thing that stood out to you? I mean, obviously being an All-American and an accomplished student athlete, was there something that surprised you or made you really feel passionate about this research?
This challenged me a lot because I was expecting for us to see a lot more differences in high and low performers. So I had to learn how to detach. Still learning. So that was a big thing. I thought we would see that these high performers, definitely have more of a growth mindset and that personal growth initiative, and the fact that we didn't see those differences probably was my biggest surprise there. And the excitement comes from the idea that the mindset interventions and personal growth interventions that have been done and finding ways to increase experiences, those are things that we can actually work to do and build in based on some of what we see. So the excitement for me comes from the idea of conducting research that could potentially inform programming and inform our work as practitioners. So I like the scholar practitioner approach, and that was something I tried to take on in this particular study.
Did they list the student athlete experiences that were positive, and if so, can we steal some of them?
If you get dizzy, you want to turn away. So I'm gonna run through and show the actual items.
That does
Almost
make,
there.
she's not kidding. This thing drives me nuts.
These were some of the academic experiences, so they're really self-driven and self-reliant. They're doing these things on their own. There's some that include the professor seeking that feedback. But what I thought about in this was the objective-based learning, actually, and I know that the staff here works really hard to create environments where students are being pushed to have these independent academic activities and facilitate those for perhaps students who might not have gone out of their way to do that previously. And then the social experiences, a lot of them have to do with gathering with other students, talking about political events or philosophies, or changing the way that you view somebody else that might be different from you, socialize with students who are not athletes.
And how did you come up with that list?
These were actually valid and reliable inventories that I used.
Oh.
So the mindset, PGI, and experiences were all valid and reliable inventories, and then the athletic performance was the only one that was piloted. But to answer your question, Dr. Keller, I think that we can find ways to integrate some of these activities, and that's part of my objective when I meet with administrators, is to pull from this and actually give them some takeaways and things that they can use in their day-to-day based on what we saw in this study. Holly?
Marissa, I'm always eager to hear what works or doesn't work with the participant recruitment. So you talked a little bit about having to go back to the drawing board and send out different modes of recruitment. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? What worked, what do you, in your mind, work the best for recruiting
Sure.
these athletes?
Well, it definitely helped when the letter was coming straight from that administrator that student knew and who they were familiar with. That's when I saw, I mean, admittedly, there were times where I'd
Makes
watch
sense.
the survey count to see if there was more coming in. And that was when we saw the peak in participation. When it was coming from a familiar person like Kim Stewart was especially led that charge, and I'm so grateful. And every time she'd send out a message, you'd see that increase right away. So someone personal to the athletic department. The text message, I think anything that's convenient and quick. I don't know if this is a revelation, but college students don't really use the email. So anything that we can do that's, and it's out of sight, out of mind. So if they don't do it right then and there, there's a high possibility they're not going to come back to it and do that survey. So I would say from that athletic administrator and the text message, definitely not the flyer.
Your flyer worked though.
Yeah,
No?
sometimes.
Yeah.
I still saw a lot of those tabs still hanging out.
Yeah, I'm so grateful for the efforts of everyone to put those in their offices. It just, for some reason, didn't grab the attention, so I'll have to consider that for next time.
I
Cindy?
will say that I do see students take pictures of things
I was
instead of
gonna say
ripping
that,
off a
yeah.
tab. They'll be like, oh, I'm gonna take a picture of this.
Ah.
So, don't
There
feel
you go.
guilty.
That's a good point. I see them do that all the time, you're right. Forgot about that.
How many of your respondents were either involved in an honors college or an honors society or some kind of, high achieving fraternity?
Yeah.
Because that could really affect, the social inventory and the academic inventory, because well, first of all, if you're in honors classes, you are going to have to go to the library and research things because your classes will force you to,
Sure. I think it was around 6 to 8% that was in the honors college, but I just want to double check. But there was pretty good representation from that group because business was the highest at about 20%. So it does make sense to me that we saw that represented pretty well based on this higher achieving population, and I think that that's a pretty high percent considering how many of our student athletes are actually in the honors college. With considering 400 to 500 student athletes per institution. I was gonna get that exact number.
I wonder if you looked at the difference, if you took those students out that are in honors and looked at the difference between the two groups, because that way their access to resources is the same, because they all have the same, I don't know, they're in the same types of classes, and like here at least in the honors college, you have access to the honors lounge and
And maybe we'd see an increase in those experiences based on those resources available. I think you're right, there's so much that can be done. My faculty, the committee told me they loved me, but they want me to finish, so we're not gonna look at, I didn't get to look at every single difference, but I would love to take this data set and
Hey, go have fun.
So that would be a great, I hadn't thought about comparing specifically the honors college, but I think that that'd be definitely something I can look at because they had to identify as one of those disciplines. So thank you.
Couple more questions?
Yeah, Pat Summit had a 100% graduation rate amongst her student athletes. And I was wondering, what does the literature say about winning programs and how it affects a student's mindset?
That, Michael, is so exciting to think about, and I haven't come across like empirical studies to look at that, but yes, like that's part of these high athletic performers having as many experiences as low athletic performers. I think it aligns with that and this holistic student athlete and this importance that's placed on the academic domain, and I think that would be a wonderful potential study as well, because I haven't seen it done. It's more discussed about in pop culture and some of those individuals who interview some of those coaches who have outstanding academic credentials, but would need to be looked
And
at
they
a little
were
further.
women.
Becky.
So looking at your frustrations maybe from the study and the return rate on getting a more diverse population, specifically academic, to me it kind of mirrors the practical frustration that academic staff has with that whole growth mindset with someone actually doing something. So you obviously had a lower return rate on the at-risk population. Would that be
Yes.
something that you would look into trying to research further if you could? That's the whole challenge, is how do you get that information from the at-risk population to figure out how it can support people like us to help them grow and learn.
Absolutely. I think we've talked about ways we can improve this study, and having more of a captive audience where you're in front of the whole athletic department and everyone's participating. I think that'd be an ideal situation because you would have that nice distribution of low and high performers. So that would be a great way to help remedy that, because it was limited to electronic communications, and what we know about low performers, they're already struggling to manage their day-to-day responsibilities. They're probably not going to take my survey. I was curious as to how many of the high performers opted into the success tips. Just something else to think about, like where their mind is versus those that are already kind of struggling and left behind a little bit. So I agree that finding a way to have everyone involved so we can help those low performers would be a great next step.
Fall orientation meetings.
Yeah.
That's what I do.
Yes, and everyone, yes,
Good idea.
that would be great.
All right, probably one more, and then we're gonna have to ask you all to leave, so. Go ahead, Rebecca.
I'm just gonna throw a random thought, idea out there, because I'm thinking about all this, and I also, I know that athletes tend to do much better in professional programs like law school, med school, and there's differing opinion as to why that is, but I also know that a lot of folks who do academic support in law schools and med schools talk about mindset and trying to teach a growth mindset. So I think there could be some interesting opportunities there for you of looking at athletes after their undergraduate experience, perhaps in a law school environment or medical school environment, where you talk about that, they reflect upon those things to get more rich data, and to also, try out your metric there and see how they would relate to that more in a reflective standpoint. So I just throw that out there as a possible consider.
Yeah, that's a great thought.
Joe, did you have one last thought?
So is this the first study to use athletic and academic performances compared with the growth mindset as a framework?
It is.
That's so awesome.
Yes, right? Thank you. We appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin. I appreciate that.
I think on that note, that would just.
Yeah, leave it there.